I want to tell you something I genuinely didn't expect to be saying right now. I've been watching this Cleveland situation develop for weeks, and I've reached a point where I can't keep treating it like just another offseason storyline. This is different. This is something I haven't quite seen structured this way in a very long time. And the more I sit with it, the more I think the people inside that building understand exactly how serious it is, and are terrified of what happens if they get it wrong. Myles Garrett asked out of Cleveland. That sentence alone should stop you cold if you understand even a fraction of what Garrett represents to that franchise. This isn't a role player angling for a bigger contract. This is the best defensive player in professional football, a man who just shattered the NFL's single-season sack record in a performance so dominant it will be studied in coaching rooms for the next 20 years, sitting across from Rich Eisen and telling the world in the most composed, measured voice imaginable that the direction of this franchise no longer aligns with why he came here. And he said it calmly. That's the part that keeps me up at night, not the content of the statement, the tone. Because I've covered enough of this league to know that when a player is frustrated, they're loud. When a player has concluded something, they're calm. Garrett wasn't frustrated. He was done. Let me take you back to one specific image that I think crystallizes everything happening in Cleveland better than any press conference ever could. Voluntary workouts. Shedeur Sanders is inside the facility. Early, focused, mic'd up because the organization wanted content from his session. Running reps, engaging with coaches, bringing the kind of energy that only the truly committed bring when nobody is forcing them to be there. And Myles Garrett, the franchise cornerstone, the record-breaking force of nature, is not there. Not injured, not dealing with something private. He simply chose not to be there. A deliberate, fully conscious absence from the same building where the organization was busy documenting their new quarterback's arrival. Those two images sitting side by side aren't a coincidence. They're two very different messages from two very different places, and the people running this organization know exactly what both of them mean. Here's what I need you to really absorb about Garrett before we go any further, because the national conversation keeps treating him like a generically disgruntled star, and that framing completely misses what makes this situation so unprecedented. This is a man who sculpts, who reads poetry, who processes the world with a philosophical depth that is almost startling in the context of professional football. When he says something publicly, it is never an accident and never heat of the moment. He has already thought through the consequences, accepted what comes next, and made peace with the direction he's chosen. What he said to Rich Eisen wasn't frustration dressed up in polished language. It was a conclusion, the kind that arrives at the end of a long, private, exhaustive internal process. And the composed delivery was the clearest possible signal of just how final that conclusion actually is. So how did we get here? Because the national narrative keeps jumping to the trade request without properly tracing the road that led to it. It doesn't start with one decision. It starts with a pattern. A series of moments where the organization's choices systematically contradicted what Garrett had been promised when he committed his prime years to staying in Cleveland. Start with Jim Schwartz. Schwartz built the Cleveland defense into one of the most dominant units in recent franchise history. His relationship with Garrett was built on real trust, earned through shared work and mutual respect. When the head coaching vacancy opened, Garrett wasn't just hoping Schwartz would get the job, he was publicly advocating for him, putting his full reputation on the line. And then Todd Monken got the job. I'm not arguing Monken was wrong on his merits, but for Garrett, watching his guy get passed over after that level of public investment created a wound in his relationship with this organization that never fully healed. It planted a seed of doubt about whether the people at the top were actually listening to those who understood the football reality most clearly. Then there was Watson. I'm not going to relitigate the entire situation because the football reality of it has been obvious to honest observers for a long time. What I want to focus on is what that contract communicated to a man who had restructured his own deal, partly on the belief that the people building around him were genuinely committed to championship-level decisions. Garrett watched that process unfold from inside the building. Multiple people with direct knowledge describe his reaction not as outrage, but as something quieter and far more corrosive. A deep, patient, accumulating disbelief. Because disbelief that goes quiet doesn't dissolve. It calcifies. It becomes the lens through which every subsequent organizational decision gets evaluated, and suddenly patterns emerge that you couldn't see before. Which brings me to the ownership dynamic, because this is the thread that keeps surfacing in every honest conversation about how that building actually operates. The picture drawn consistently by people with real proximity to it is of a persistent structural gap. between what the football staff evaluates and recommends and what the decision maker at the top ultimately chooses. The football people reach conclusions. Those conclusions move through the organization. And then Jimmy Haslam arrives at decisions that don't always reflect what the people who understand football best have been telling him. Elite players feel the consequences of that gap on the field every single week. They live inside the results of decisions they didn't make and weren't consulted on. 8 years of that accumulation for a player with Garrett's analytical intelligence and his level of investment in this franchise's success produces exactly the kind of quiet, reasoned, irrevocable conclusion he delivered to Rich Eisen. And here's the detail that got completely buried by the volume of coverage around the trade request itself. The detail that tells you more about where Garrett's head was than anything he said publicly. He called LeBron James before he went public. Let that breathe for a second. He didn't call his agent. He didn't call a teammate. He called LeBron, the one person on the planet with direct personal experience of what it actually costs to reach the conclusion that the championship window you came to build doesn't exist in the place where you've been trying to build it. Garrett was preparing, asking what the transition feels like from someone who'd lived it. You don't make that call when you're frustrated. You make it when you've already finished the internal work and you're getting ready for what comes next. Then Andrew Berry walked to the podium. I watched that press conference carefully, and I want to translate it because NFL front office language requires translation. Berry acknowledged Garrett's accomplishments. He confirmed awareness of the situation without committing to specifics that could constrain the organization's options. He used the vocabulary of someone coached by legal and communications professionals to appear responsive while actually committing to nothing. What I didn't hear was resolution. What I heard was the carefully maintained calm of someone managing a situation in real time, buying runway, hoping the temperature drops before the next pressure point arrives. And the problem with that approach is that the person whose temperature they're managing has already demonstrated he sees through exactly that kind of language. Now, Shedeur Sanders, his story keeps getting swallowed by the organizational drama surrounding him, and I think that's genuinely unfair to what he's actually done inside all of this. Walk through the environment he stepped into. Watson still physically present, his situation unresolved. A national media narrative that had formed strong opinions before he'd taken a single professional snap. A fan base divided between hope and exhaustion. A locker room still recalibrating after regime change. And Shedeur's response to every single one of those pressures was identical. Show up earlier than everyone else, work harder than the situation requires, and refuse to let the external turbulence contaminate internal preparation. He hasn't given interviews seeking sympathy. He hasn't campaigned publicly for his starting role. He's just been relentlessly, quietly, impressively present. That quality, maintaining full professional commitment inside a genuinely dysfunctional organizational environment without letting it crack your preparation, is the one thing that separates quarterbacks who survive their first NFL season from the ones who get consumed by it. It cannot be taught. And in Shedeur Sanders, from everything described about what happens inside that facility every morning, it is demonstrably there. Garrett has seen it. He's been one of Shedeur's most vocal internal advocates since day one. Not in a vague, politically safe way, but specifically and concretely. He's talked about Shedeur arriving before the coaches, film sessions at hours when the rest of the roster is nowhere near the facility, a maturity of preparation that commands genuine respect from people who've seen a lot of quarterbacks come through NFL locker rooms. Coming from the most respected voice in that building, that level of specific endorsement tells every person in that locker room that the evaluation has already been made by the people who are actually there every day, and that the conclusion isn't complicated. Mandatory minicamp arrives in June, and that date has taken on a weight far beyond any normal roster evaluation deadline. It's functioning as a pressure test for everything currently unresolved inside that organization. If Garrett's situation is still publicly ambiguous when that date comes, if there's still no unambiguous organizational commitment to Shedeur as the starting quarterback, if Watson's presence continues generating deliberate uncertainty that the football staff has to navigate around rather than through, then Cleveland walks into training camp carrying a burden almost impossible to shed once the real work begins. That combination, unresolved, doesn't just produce a bad season, it produces the kind of fracture that sets a franchise back not for 1 year, but for an entire era. What makes this genuinely heartbreaking to watch is that the ingredients for something real are actually present in Cleveland right now. Not theoretically, evaluably, demonstrably present. The offensive infrastructure rebuilt with real intention. The receiver room reconstructed thoughtfully. A legitimate coaching vision. Garrett at full engagement as the most disruptive defensive force in football, and a young quarterback whose preparation nobody inside that building has questioned. That roster, stripped of the organizational noise surrounding it, has real potential for the first time in a meaningful stretch. And that is exactly what makes the current dysfunction so crushing, because potential doesn't wait patiently while organizations resolve their internal alignment issues. It exists in specific windows with specific people at specific moments in their careers, and when those windows close because the people in charge couldn't make the decisions the evidence was pointing them toward, they don't come back on the same terms. The resolution isn't structurally complicated. The difficulty isn't in the mechanics of the decision. It's in the will to actually make it. Commit to Shedeur Sanders as the starting quarterback of this franchise, not as a managed situation, not as an open competition designed to protect organizational flexibility, fully, publicly, unconditionally. Give him the platform his preparation has already earned in the eyes of the people who see him every day. And in making that commitment with real weight behind it, give Myles Garrett a reason to look at the trajectory of this franchise and see something different from what he's been seeing for 8 years. Because this isn't actually a story about a player wanting to leave. That's the surface version. The real story is about a man who gave 8 years of elite, borderline supernatural effort to an organization, watched it consistently make decisions that undermine the foundation of what he was working toward, and is now simply asking, through the only language the NFL actually responds to, whether anyone with decision-making authority is finally ready to make choices worthy of the players they've been fortunate enough to build around. The window that exists right now in Cleveland, with these specific people at these specific moments in their careers, will not stay open indefinitely. The clock is running. Everyone inside that building knows it. The only question left is whether the people with the power to act are going to use it before it's too late to matter.